This is not your typical business case. It is a case about an entrepreneur of a growing African country trying to decide if he should build a port in this country or not. It's a pretty tough case, and we're gonna structure it today so we can stretch your abilities of adapting the 3Cs and creating a structure for pretty much any business problem. So if you can build a good structure for this case, you can be quite sure that you're going to be able to build a structure for pretty much any business case in your case interviews. And we're going to talk about public sector in a later video. So pay attention to this drill, try to do it with all your heart, and then watch my answer and try to absorb as much as you can. Now, here are some guidelines regarding time, the same from the other drills. If you're on skill building modes, if you're trying to learn how to create, how to adapt your frameworks well, take 10 to 15 minutes to structure this case. There's no need to rush, and later you can improve your timing when you're doing mock interviews. I'd say more than 95% of you guys are in skill or should be in skill building mode. Now, if you already know how to structure really well and you're just trying to improve your times, then 2 to 3 minutes to structure, which is how much you get in an interview. A lot of people come to me to ask, hey Bruno, some people are saying that I only have a minute to structure in an interview. So let me quickly address this here. You get 2 to 3 minutes before your interviewer gets impatient if you're taking those minutes to write down a lot of ideas on paper and they can see it because they're right in front of you. So if you're taking a little longer than a minute, 2-3 minutes, and they can see from your writing that you're doing a good job, they're not going to get bothered of giving you a bit more time. They very much prefer a candidate that takes a bit longer to structure and comes up with a really good structure than one that takes a minute and falls into the guidelines that are not written anywhere, really, and come up with a structure that is really not really good. So, and by the way, I've never met a candidate who can do a good structure in just 1 minute. Not even I can do that. To do a good structure that's exhaustive, you need to have ideas, you need to write them down, you need to cover a lot of stuff. So regardless of if you're doing a case at McKinsey, at Bain, at BCG, if they say, even if the interviewer tells you you just have a minute, you can safely ignore that. I've done that in my interviews. I've recommended that to all my coaching clients, and none of them did poorly because they took 2-3 minutes. No one's really counting the time anyway. All the interviewer wants is you not wasting your time, and most candidates waste their time because they don't know how to structure, but that's not you. You're gonna know how to structure, so take your time to structure well in your interview. In this drill, however, take a bit more. Take 10 to 15 minutes so you can learn how to actually build them before you can learn how to do it quickly. So let's jump into the case. The case question is pretty simple. Should an African entrepreneur build a port in his country? And that's all you get. I mean, you could ask clarifying questions, of course, which is what we're doing next. So let's jump into that. A structure is a plan to solve a problem. That's the basic definition. Clarifying questions are only needed when you don't know exactly what the problem is, when you need to define the problem. And if so, you can't build a plan to structure a problem because you don't know this problem. So my 2 clarifying questions for this case are there because these are 2 areas that could change the nature of the problem that we need to solve, and so my structure to solve it. So let's jump into the clarifying questions themselves. I have 2 of them. Who is this entrepreneur? And does he have the capital and the connections? And second, what is the economy structure? What is the economic structure of this country? What does the economy of this country look like? Now let's check the answers. Let's say this entrepreneur is a rich and influential businessman who wants to remain anonymous, and that you can assume that he's got the capital and the connections to do so. And the answer to the second question is that this country's primary economic activities are agriculture, mining, and the oil industries. Now, let me just go through really quickly the reasoning behind these two clarifying questions. My two clarifying questions are there because these are two areas that could change the nature of the problem, and so my structure to solve it. Your clarifying questions may be different and still be good. For example, you could ask if this country already has a port, or if this is going to be the first port in this country, or how do they export their stuff currently. I honestly think that this case doesn't need any clarifying questions to be solved. But it's still safer to ask a couple of good ones because it shows your interviewer that you're aware that you need to define well the problem before attempting to solve it. So even if you're pretty sure about the nature of the problem, it's still better to confirm a couple of things so that you're signaling to your interviewer that you understand that this is really important. Now pause the video, take your time, write down your structure, and preferably record it in your smartphone, your delivery of it, and then come back to the video and watch my answer just so you can compare it with yours and gain some insights along the way. So here we go. I'll start my answer, and I'll do that as in other drills, first listing the categories, then talking through my issues or key questions. It's another way to call them. And then the third step is to, in each issue or in each key question, mention what's the underlying hypothesis or the underlying reason why we need that information. And from now on, I'm gonna speak as I would to the interviewer. So to help this African entrepreneur decide if he should build a port in this country or not, I have to analyze 5 categories. The first is the demand for port services in this country, and I'd focus on exports because it seems like a country that exports a lot of raw materials. So exports demand for ports is probably larger than imports. Then I want to know, what is this port like? I imagine they have, this entrepreneur has a specific port in mind, or if he doesn't, what could be reasonable ports to build in this country like? The third category, I want to understand other competing ports, national and international. So other ports that agricultural producers or mines or oil producers in this country use to export their products. Next, fourth category, I want to understand what are the national issues in the country that might influence this decision. I mean, a port is a huge infrastructure project for a developing country. So we need to understand if the country itself is, quote unquote, worthy of this port. And then finally, I want to double check this entrepreneur just to see if he's the right person to do that. So let's start with the demand for port services. There are 3 main things that I want to look at here. The first one is I want to get a sense of what the exports and the imports and the domestic economy is like. So what are the types of industries exporting, importing, and in the domestic economy, and the volumes of this. I need to know how much is exported, how much is imported, and so on. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first one is to size the current demand of exports and imports, and then the domestic economy part is to see the potential for latent export or import, mainly export demand, due to high operations costs or logistical bottlenecks. So the hypothesis here is that if this country had a new port that is cheaper to operate and thus has cheaper fees, or that could expand the capacity, that they could export more or move their domestic economy more. Now, the second issue I want to analyze is demand growth. And here there are 2 things as well. First is the expected growth from current industries. So we have some crops that we cultivate, some types of mines in this country. What is the expected growth from these industries? This could be from more demand internationally, or from currency shifts that make other countries preferably buy from this country because it's cheaper due to a currency shift, or even productivity improvements. I also want to know what are the new mining, agriculture, or oil projects in this country. If there are current mines being built or other type of land being developed, we can pretty, not precisely, but we can pretty confidently size the growth of demand for port services, so the growth of exports in this country. Finally, I want to know what is the customer satisfaction with the current exporting infrastructure. What is the cost to use the ports they use today, if there are time delays, if there's company-specific bureaucracy that we could avoid, or if the current ports are losing cargo or something that may disrupt these businesses' activities. My next step, after analyzing this demand with these 3 key questions, is to understand what is this port like. And now there are 3 questions that I want to ask again. The first one is regarding location. Are we close to the demand? Are we going to be close to the mines or to the agriculture fields or to the oil producers? And then also I want to know the quality of the demand. So regarding the proximity, the hypothesis is that for agriculture products, for mining products, even oil, there's high land transportation costs compared to the value of the product. So logistics is really important. If we build a port too far away from them, they may still use other options because it's cheaper to take the products to the port. Regarding quality, it's basically if the waters are deep enough to receive cargo ships, if they're calm enough for the port to be operating day in and day out. Now, the next issue here is the projected capacity, either in containers or ships per year. I don't know how they measure capacity in this industry, but the idea here is to compare with latent demand or with demand growth to project the utilization rates. So we need to balance our capacity, the capacity of the market, and the growth in demand to know how much of the port is going to be utilized, given the competitiveness of this port against other ports. Finally, the technology. How good are we going to be able to handle products? So maybe we will have technology that makes we handle liquids such as oil or food products such as agriculture products better than our competitors. And also the technology related to productivity. So if we are going to be a more productive port, I have a hypothesis that this is really important because if a ship comes and we can load it much faster than other ports, this ship's going to be being utilized. It's going to be sailing for more days in the year. If I were a ship operator, I'd like to go to a port that can quickly unload my ship, reload it with other goods, and start sailing as soon as possible because I want that ship to be sailing more time and waiting for products to be loaded less time. And this is related to the port productivity. So if we're a port with more productivity than other ports, other competing ports, we will probably get a lot more business than if we're as productive or less productive than other ports. So these are the 3 issues related to port location, the capacity, and the technology. Now, I also want to analyze the other competing ports, the ports that get business from this agriculture, mining, and oil companies in this country. The first thing is I'd look into the same 3 things as in our port. And then I'd also look into 3 other things. The first is, can they improve their productivity? So say they're less productive than our port will be, which will bring business to us. Can they improve this productivity to be competitive again? And if so, with low or with high investment? So the hypothesis here is that they're going to react to our product being more productive if they can. Because if they're losing business because of productivity issues, they're going to react, they're going to invest, especially if it's a low investment thing. Now, maybe they can't be more productive at all, even if they invest, because of the way the port is set up and the bay they chose to build this port. You get the idea. Maybe they can't improve productivity even with high investment, which would be really good for us. Or maybe then they can easily improve productivity, which would take that advantage away from us. Now, the other thing that I'd look at is the current utilization rate, just to see if they're fully utilized, which means there's room for an pants in capacity, or if they have low utilization, which means that they could basically do price wars against it. So if they have high utilization, we can capture demand more easily. And if they have low utilization and we build a port, they're probably going to be even lower in utilization unless they drop prices. Because this is a fixed cost heavy business, they will be able to drop prices further. Probably if they're pricing above marginal cost, they will, and they will want to do that because they can't afford to lose business. Finally, I want to know what their operational problems are. What, if anything, is bringing customer dissatisfaction down? So if the customers are dissatisfied with timeliness or loss of cargo or costs, all the stuff that we've explored in the demand side of the analysis, here on the competition side of the analysis, I want to know what are the operational problems that are leading these ports, these competing ports, to have their customers dissatisfied. Because maybe they're easy fixes, or maybe they're really tough things to change. If it's tough, then bringing a new port to the market will make even more sense. Now, I don't want to build a port in a country unless I know that that country doesn't have any issues that might negatively influence this building of the port, because a port is an infrastructure project. I can't just take it away of the country if something happens and move it to other country. I just will lose the investment. And there are a few things that I want to look at here. First is the political stability. My hypothesis is that if the country is not stable politically, it's not worth the risk of making a long-term fixed investment here. Because what if there's a government takeover and we just lose the port due to political reasons? Might as well build a port in a neighboring country that's more stable politically. Second, what are the required permits to build a port and to operate a port? Third, is there civil or political corruption? And here, the idea or the hypothesis is that in order to build and operate this port with certain degree of stability, the entrepreneur might need someone's favor, quote unquote, to do the project. It is an African country. I don't know which one, but many of them are plagued with corruption. And I'm not saying the entrepreneur should get these favors, quote unquote, from people. But the idea is we need to know beforehand so that then the entrepreneur does whatever he feels comfortable doing. I don't know anything about this country, but the thing is, if there's corruption and if this corruption is so ingrained in the system that they can't operate a port without doing borderline illegal stuff or even illegal stuff, it's better to know it beforehand. And we're not lawyers, but we need to make the client aware of that if he's not already. Then we need to check about the unions. Port operations require really specific people to work at it. These people are probably unionized because of the nature of the job. And if unions are really strong in this country and tend to be aggressive, we run the risk of not operating well. Finally, the tax and finances of this country, both taxation for port services, because that's part of the work, but primarily, is this country economically stable in the long run? Because I don't want to make a huge long-term investment in a country that is probably gonna have an economic crisis in the next few years or so on. So I checked that as well. And finally, the entrepreneur. There's a few things that I want to know about him, and we've checked a bit in the clarifying question, but I just want to make sure that he has the knowledge, the connections, and the access to capital to build and operate a port. I found it strange at the case question that it is an entrepreneur and not a conglomerate or an infrastructure company or a private equity. It's one person. And it's weird because, maybe a really rich and influential person, but a port is a $1 billion+ project. Usually it is. It's a huge project, and can one person do it? And the dimensions I analyze is knowledge, connections, and access to capital. So that's how I would structure this problem and tackle this idea of building a port in this country. And the first thing I would look at here would probably be the demand for port services in the country. I think if there's no demand, it makes no sense to build this port. And if we find that there is no demand, then I would look at the competition just to make sure that, maybe there's no latent or excess demand, but we can still be profitable because the competition is so bad and they can't do anything about it. So if we build this, we will get all the market share in this market, and we can be successful even if demand doesn't grow. So these are the two areas that I'd start with. Actually, before I start doing that, I'd ask a few questions about the national issues, because if it's a politically charged environment, maybe it doesn't make sense. Even if demand grows, it's too risky of an investment. Although I'd assume this entrepreneur knows what he's doing in this side. So yeah, let me circle back and let's start with demand first. Now let's debrief this case. And this is kind of the more tactical debrief, and then we'll do a business sense debrief as well to talk about the specific issues that were in this case. So the first theme here is that this structure is the adapted 3Cs, which makes sense because we're in the part of the course where we adapt the 3Cs. However, this case was pretty tough to adapt. It's a stretch. The structure doesn't look much like the 3Cs. And here's the adaptations I made just so you can make sense of it. The first one is, instead of calling customers, I called it demand. And the reason is, a lot of ports will have specific customers that they deal with, but others, and some of the customers are kind of unknown, let's call it like that. There's a mass of products and cargo that needs to come into the country and leave the country. And in this case, the port offers the infrastructure to do so. So they don't really know their customers that well, or at least many of the customers. So, and they should think about aggregate demands. How much stuff is leaving and getting in the country? The second change I did, instead of calling the company, I broke it down into the port and the entrepreneur. And the reason is there is no company yet, but there's a port, or there's going to be a port, and there is an entrepreneur. So there's the infrastructure side of the company, and there is the person, or the people side of the company, which in this case is just one person. And there are specific things I want to know about each, but there's no company yet. And it wouldn't make sense to have a company bucket asking about organizational structure or culture or competitive advantages, because there is no company. We need to know about the port and about the entrepreneur. Also, I called competition the other ports, or the other export-import infrastructure for this kind of goods, agriculture, oil, and mining. Now, you could argue that, you can export and import via airplane or by land, but because it's an African country and I assume that they're not exporting and importing a lot by land, it might be a wrong assumption, and actually it's something that I check with the interviewer. But my assumption is that they're exporting to other continents. Who buys food and oil and mine products from Africa? Usually more developed countries. Although I could be wrong here. Now, airplane doesn't make sense at all because of the type of product we're talking about. We're talking about raw materials, and exporting via airplane would be too expensive. So I called competition the other ports, which makes sense. And then I added a category called the country, or national issues. And this is kind of a broader category where I put in every other player, every other decision maker that could influence this, and they're part of the country. So the unions and the corrupt or potentially corrupt government officials or politicians, and the country's finances, and so on. And the second issue that's important for you to take away from this case in terms of how to build the case, how to present the framework, is that I explained all the major issues. And I did so using three main tools. First is whys, second is hypothesis, and third is examples. And they're pretty much, they're cousins, they're similar. So whys is basically, well, I need to know this information because this, and this. So it's an why way to explain it. Another one is hypothesis, so basically scenarios. I need to know this information because this scenario could happen. I have this hypothesis of what could happen, and in this case, this information would be highly relevant. And we don't know if this scenario is true or not. That's why it's a hypothesis, but we want to know. And then examples. So you can say, well, I need to know if there's any source of latent demand or any growth in demand that we might know of. For example, new mines being built in the country or new oil extraction platforms or anything like that. Okay, so this is the debrief for this case. Structures the adapted 3Cs and explain major issues with whys, hypotheses, and examples. You can stretch the 3Cs a lot if you want, and you get a completely different structure from the 3Cs, but that still makes sense. Just use the technique that we taught in the video explaining how to adapt the 3Cs. Now let's move on to the business sense debrief, where I will explain to you what are the issues that you couldn't have missed, what are some issues that will add value and make you outstanding as a candidate in terms of business sense. And then there's one specific issue that I want to talk about because of being sensitive to the client and to the issue at hand. So let's start with 3 required issues to do well in this case. The first one is future demand. Building a port is a very long-term investment. If you as a candidate just ask, well, what is the demand for port services now? And its projected growth in terms of a number. It's growing 3% per year. Oh, that's cool. That's not an insightful way to do it. You need to do it better. You need to know where does this future demand come from. And you need to make the interviewer aware that you know that future demand is perhaps more important than current demand. We're talking about building a port. It's not something that goes away in a few years. It's something that lasts for decades. Second issue, capacity. You need to have mentioned capacity of the port, of the other ports versus the demand. So the whole capacity of the market after you build this port should be well-sized versus the demand. What does well-sized mean is subject to other analysis, but basically you need to be profitable. If you're building a port in a country that has excess capacity for ports, it's probably not going to be profitable. Third, stability of the country. That's the main source of risk. And I'm talking about political stability, economical stability. And the key thing here is this is a very long-term investment. So this makes future demand be a critical issue, but it also makes stability of the country be a critical reason, especially as you couple that with it being a developing African country. So these 3 issues should be in your framework in some form or shape. And if you didn't include them, if you missed it, you made a mistake. And you'd probably get a call from the consulting firm or your interviewer telling you, well, unfortunately, you're not going to go to next round because your business sense wasn't good enough. Now, there are 3 standout issues, 3 issues that if you did mention, you would stand out as a candidate. Having a standout issue doesn't make you bulletproof to not saying the required issues. You still need the required issues. But as you add these standout issues, your interviewer is going to get a sense that you have an excellent business sense. And these are some examples. There may be others. The first one is productivity matters because ships want to be sailing. So I've gone through that in the framework presentation. Let me go through it again for those of you who didn't understand because I was a bit quick there. So here's the deal. A ship operator likely has the option to choose which port to get the cargo from. And if you're a ship operator, you have a huge cost, which is your ship. It's millions of dollars capital expense, and you want that ship to be sailing, because if it's stuck in a port because of some bureaucracy or lack of productivity in the port, you're just losing money. Just like an airline wants its airplanes to be flying, a ship operator wants its ships to be sailing. And one driver of whether a ship is parked in the port or not is the port productivity. So the ability of the port to quickly unload and load your ship. Some of it is off the port's control, but some of this productivity is due to the operation of the port. So how well organized they are, how much technology do they have to load and unload? Are their workers skilled? So recognizing that your port gets business as they are productive, and that this could be an issue, a competitive advantage for the sport, is something that makes you stand out in business sense. Now, let me make a side note here. I don't even know if in real life this actually matters or not. Maybe it doesn't matter because all ports are as productive and there's little difference. Maybe the cargo operators, the ship operators can't really choose what port to use because, I don't know, some regulation, or because who chooses is the person who's exporting or sending the materials. I don't even know if this is an issue or not. And here's the deal with business sense. You don't need to know stuff. You don't need to have facts about the port operator market or the international shipping market. What you need to know is have good business logic. And I'm saying here that if ship operators can choose the port, and if there's a variance between how long a ship is parked there, depending on the port productivity, then it makes sense that a ship operator wants to choose a port that is more productive, and thus this more productive port will get a boost in market share. Now, I'm saying if-then statements based on business logic, and so should you. As a consultant, you get the chance to talk to people who know about port operations and the shipping market and everything else in between. But what they're testing in the interview is really if you're able to ask the right questions to these people. And if you're able to craft this kind of logic in your interview, your interviewer is going to be sure that if you're faced with a similar situation, you're going to be able to call an expert within the consulting firm, outside of the consulting firm, or even look up in Google or ask your client these questions and then come up with the logic that shows, you're going to be much more productive, which means you're going to get this much market share more. So I was saying all this logic. I don't even know if the facts are true, but if they are true, then it's important to ask them because of this. Second issue, port location matters because of low dollar value per kilogram or per pound if you're American. And this happens because we're dealing with mining and agricultural products. Now, this is important because if you're selling jewelry, you can afford to transport your product for longer distances through more expensive means, airplanes and everything. If you're selling TVs or furniture, you don't care too much about the freight costs. I mean, you always care, but it's not that big of a deal because compared to the value of the product you're transporting, the freight cost is not very relevant. Now, if you're selling iron ore or soybeans, the value per kilogram is not very high. These are raw materials. And transportation costs are driven by how much weight you send or volume. It depends. But the key thing here is a trucking operator doesn't care if they transport iron ore or expensive vehicles. They care about how much it weighs, what's the volume, and here's the cost to transport. And if the port is too far away, maybe it's cheaper to go through that port, but you have to transport your goods for a longer road and thus pay higher land transportation costs. The person who's exporting is looking at total exporting costs, not just what they spend with you. So because this country exports low dollar value per kilogram products, port location matters. And if you're able to make that logic or something like that, then it will really make you stand out. Third, currency fluctuations. These are an important long-term driver for port demand in countries with a weak monetary policy. So I don't know if this country has a weak monetary policy or not. I don't even know what country this is, but it's an African country. It's developing, probably not as strong as the dollar in the US or the euro in Europe. They probably have a weaker monetary policy with their exchange rates. And if this is true, then, what if their currency appreciates a lot in the short run? That makes the exports drop, which makes the demand for port for port services in this country lower. So you have to be able to make that logic, that connection. Make sense? Now there's an issue that I want to talk about here, which is corruption. It is a sensitive topic that I talked about in a sensitive way. And I did so because you're a consultant, you're not a lawyer. You have to talk about that topic because it's important to your client. But you have to be politically neutral. And honestly, it's even hard to judge if the entrepreneur wants to go through with this, even if they have to pay some people or whatever, because maybe it's the way things work in this country. I personally wouldn't do it, but I know that a consulting firm wouldn't approve this because it's illegal, it's immoral. But so this topic has to be handled in a very sensitive way. In a sensitive way, because you can't say, yeah, go through with this, it's fine. But you have to handle this topic because it's important to make the decision. Now, the way this is handled in real projects is by much more senior people. Probably no one below partner would talk about this. But in a case interview, if the topic comes up, talk about it. Just make sure you're sensitive and talk in a way, frame the discussions as if you were talking to your manager, your partner within the consulting firm, because it's safer that way. If you frame the framework presentation as if you were telling the client this, then it raises some, I wouldn't say red flags, but maybe yellow flags. So this is it for this case. Go through your own framework, compare with this page of required issues, standout issues, compare with my own answer of the framework, and I hope you've learned something. I hope you've learned how to stretch the 3Cs and adapt them really well. I hope you've learned how to come up with good issues for your cases, even infrastructure cases if you get some of them, but even if you don't, there are ideas here that could be used in other cases as well. Hope you've liked this drill. I hope it was useful, and I'll see you in the next one.